So imagine this. You're standing in a quiet marble corridor. The floor beneath you is cold, polished like water. Tapestries flutter gently along the walls, though no windows are open. And at the end of the hallway, there's a mirror, tall, framed in gold leaf, older than any book in the royal library. But something strange, no one dares to look into it. Servants pass it without glancing. Guards avoid standing near it. And in the grand chamber beyond, the king himself has covered every mirror with velvet cloth. He says it's to keep the light soft, but everyone knows he's afraid of what he might see. Not his face, but something deeper. A shadow that whispers truths no crown can silence. Tonight, we're going to quietly unfold the story of a ruler who waged war not with swords, but with reflection. A man whose deepest fear wasn't a rival or a rebellion, but a piece of polished glass that remembered things he wanted to forget. And hey, just before we tiptoe down those candlelit halls, I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight? Drop your city and what time it is in the comments below. It still amazes me how these stories reach you, whether it's morning where you are or the stars are already out. All right? Find your cozy place. Let the blankets pull close. Breathe in gently and let the quiet begin, because the mirrors are waiting and the story is about to begin. They say every castle, no matter how grand, holds one room that no servant dares to enter alone. A room that carries silence differently, not as absence, but as presence. In this kingdom, nestled atop mist-covered cliffs where seagulls cried like lost lullabies. Such a room sat in the far reaches of the eastern wing. You'd have to pass under the seventh arch, the one with ivy curling like question marks across its ribs, and continue past the faded tapestry of the weeping deer, whose stitched eyes had grown dull with age, always watching yet never seeing. And there, hidden in a bend of the corridor that sunlight rarely touched, stood the door, modest, unmarked, yet colder than all the stone around it. The kind of cold that felt borrowed, like winter had left a piece of itself behind. Inside, the room was small. Smaller than you'd expect in a palace of such size. No furniture, no paintings, just stillness. And a mirror, tall and narrow, with corners etched in silver so delicately that the patterns had begun to fade, like language spoken too softly over too many years. Its surface, once polished and proud, now held a film of dust no one dared wipe away. Time had touched the frame, dulled the gleam, but something beneath remained, something the castle itself seemed to breathe around. The king had not always avoided this place. In his youth, before silence wrapped itself around his crown, he had been a boy of mischief and light. He dashed through the halls barefoot, startling the guards with his laughter, sliding down polished floors as the cooks chased him with wooden spoons and warm bread. Back then, mirrors were magic, not tools of fear, but wonder. He would press his nose against the glass until it fogged with breath, drawing shapes with his finger, giggling at how his reflection followed imperfectly. The servants adored him. Even the paintings seemed to smile wider in his presence. But years passed, as they do, not with thunder, but with dust. His father grew tired. His mother, quieter. Then, one winter, the queen's voice left the halls for good, and something in the boy's posture changed. He still wore the crown when the time came, still walked with grace, still ruled with a calm voice and measured eyes. But a shadow had folded itself behind his gaze, slow sadness. Not dramatic, just persistent. Like fog that forgets how to lift. Now in his middle years, the king dressed in black. Not for mourning, he insisted, simply because it was quiet. He no longer wore the velvet greens and blues of court, nor the golden pins that once gleamed in the sunlight. His chambers were kept dim even at noon. The thick curtains pulled so tightly that no breeze dared enter. Candles burned constantly, wax pooling in slow surrender, flickering against stone that never fully warmed. Servants spoke in hushed tones, careful with their steps, glancing toward the eastern wing without ever letting their feet carry them. There. And though no one was ever told why, everyone knew the truth in the way only silence can teach. Mirrors had been banned. One by one, they were removed from the palace, carried out under cloth, their reflections unseen. Fragments of them buried beneath the rose garden, frames repurposed, rooms repainted. But one remained. This mirror. This room, untouched, not hidden, just left. And the door, strangely, always stood slightly ajar, not open, but not sealed. A sliver wide enough for a whisper to pass through. As if the room had something to say, but never quite said it. No one knew what changed, not exactly. There had been no scream, no night of storms. Just the quiet withdrawal of a man once known for his brightness. Some said he had seen something in the mirror. Not a ghost, not a prophecy, but a truth too delicate to hold. Others believed it was the queen's absence, carved too deeply into his heart. But whatever it was, it lingered. He never entered the room again, never touched the frame. And yet, he never ordered its destruction. He had every opportunity, every right, but the mirror stayed. Like a wound left uncovered, or a letter never burned. Perhaps some whispered, some small part of him still believed it held something unfinished, a question not fully asked, a memory not yet ready to fade. And when sleep refused him, when the candles burned too low to comfort, and the night pressed heavy on the windows, he would sometimes rise, wrapped in nothing but a thin robe, feet bare against the cold floor. He would walk slowly toward the eastern wing, never entering, never speaking, just standing there in the hall, breathing, and staring at the door he could not cross. Not because of the mirror, but because of what it remembered when he did. The sky above the palace was always a little hazy that year, not with storm clouds, not with dust or smoke, but with a kind of light that made everything seem like it had already been remembered. A quiet golden hue that settled across the rooftops and softened the sharpness of the world. It made stone look older, made colors fade just slightly. Even the air, especially in the mornings, carried the weight of something that had been waiting too long to be said. The stone lions by the front gate, once carved with such intent and pride, eyes alert, jaws parted mid-roar, now seemed to blink more slowly when viewed from a distance, their outlines blurred by time and lichen. The years had not broken them. They had simply been gentled, like so many things in the kingdom. The king, too, moved differently now. He no longer walked the outer halls where tall windows lined the walls like rivers of light, reflecting the garden back into itself, repeating the same green over and over again like a dream repeating its favorite part. He used to love those halls, used to pause in front of the glass just to watch the sun chase itself across the polished floor. But now, he avoided them entirely. Instead, he stayed in the western wing, in rooms where velvet covered the walls and no window remained undressed. The curtains were heavy, thick enough to mute the shape of the day outside. Sometimes, a servant would peek through the layers and find that it was snowing, or raining, or glowing in gold, and still. Inside, the air stayed dim, as if the walls themselves had made a pact not to let joy in unless it was requested. The staff began to notice the small changes, the sort of shifts that no one ever mentions first. Mirrors vanished quietly from guest rooms. Trays that once gleamed with polished silver were replaced with carved wooden ones, the grain always facing downward. Even the central fountain, which once murmured like a gentle river in the courtyard, was drained without a word, its basin left dry and silent like a mouth that had forgotten how to speak. Visitors were received less often. Invitations grew rare. Some were turned away at the gate. Others never received replies at all. And in the corridor of ancestry, where proud portraits once told the story of kings and queens long gone, the walls now hung bare. Only the outlines remained, faint shadows where frames had protected the stone from fading. They looked like ghosts, not angry, just forgotten. Some said it was grief, that whatever joy the queen once poured into the palace had been sipped dry, and all that remained now was the echo of her absence. Others whispered of a vision, something the king had once seen, just once, in a mirror no longer spoken of. A vision not shared, a moment too strange, or too sacred, or too painful to explain. Whatever it was, it seemed to settle into his bones like winter. Not harsh, not loud, but total. It made his shoulders slope, made his silences longer. And though he still wore the crown, still sat the throne, something in his presence had grown quieter, not in volume, but in certainty. When he entered the throne room, his steps were soft, not cautious, just listening, like he was waiting for a sound that hadn't yet arrived. His advisors noticed. They adjusted their helmets slower, held their breath longer when speaking. The court jesters, once bold in their foolishness, now told gentler jokes. The palace, famed once for its music, feasts that spilled out into the gardens with firelight and dancing, now felt like a room waiting to exhale. Somewhere in that hush, down those long corridors where laughter no longer bounced, a question began to take shape. Not just among the servants or the nobles or the scholars, but in the stone, in the air, in the way candlelight moved slightly differently now. What had the king seen, and why did it change him? No one asked. No one needed to, because the answer was not a sentence. It was a feeling. It lingered in his chambers, in his quiet refusals, and the way he touched nothing with both hands anymore. And though he never said it aloud, though he never once gave it a name, the fear clung to him like a scent, faint, cold, and unshakable. Not the kind of fear that chases, but the kind that waits. It's the kind that reflects. Silver, still watching. Years before the silence began, its slow and steady drift across the palace like morning fog settling into stone. The western wing had been the brightest part of the entire estate. That was where the queen kept her world, the things she loved, the things she touched often, softly, like petals she couldn't quite part with. There were canvases along the corridor, unfinished and breathing with brushstrokes that waited for her return. Books stacked not by title or topic, but by warmth, stories she'd reread, poems she'd underlined, pages still folded where she paused and never resumed. Violets bloomed in every sill, even in winter, as though the air itself bent toward her hands. The walls were dressed in golden wallpaper, faded now, but once glowing, patterned with faint leaves that danced as the light moved. Arched windows lined the southern edge of the wing, tall and elegant. And when the wind swept through just right, it didn't howl, it sang. That wing had music in its bones. Laughter that knew how to stay quiet. Secrets that didn't ask. To be kept, only cherished. But then, the light dimmed. Not all at once. Just a little at first, the way twilight announces itself long before the sky turns. The queen fell ill, slowly, gently, as if even her body couldn't bear to leave too quickly. And as her laughter faded, the halls began to still. The king, unable to bear the echo of her footsteps now absent, stopped visiting. He gave no order, made no grand declaration. He simply turned away, said it reminded him too much of what he never said. Perhaps he couldn't. Perhaps he didn't know how. Over time, the wing was sealed. Not with chains or keys, but with small, quiet gestures. Curtains drawn, flowers removed. One by one, doors were locked. Not by the steward's hand, but by absence. Until finally, only one room remained untouched. A chamber at the very end of the corridor. It wasn't grand. No throne, no chandelier. Just a soft, private space that still breathed like she had never left. The door never shut quite right. It leaned, always just slightly open, like an unfinished sentence. It was there, on a morning few remembered, one of those mornings where the world feels like it hasn't quite woken up yet, that the king found himself walking, not with purpose, but with unrest. He was half-dressed, a thin robe wrapped loosely around him, his feet bare against the cold floor. The castle slept. No footsteps echoed behind him. No guards waited ahead. Only the soft shuffle of slippers on marble, and the strange pull of something not forgotten, but unresolved. The room had not changed. It smelled of her faintly, like the last note of a song someone hummed years ago. A trace of perfume still lingered in the corners. A shawl rested on the back of a velvet chair, folded neatly, patiently. On the vanity sat a brush, bristles worn, curved by years of use, resting as if it still remembered her hand. And beside it, the mirror. Oval, tall, framed in a silver so strangely twisted it looked like it had been shaped by heat. Softened, then frozen in place. He had never liked it. Said once it looked like it was melting. Said it felt wrong, but she loved it. Said it made things softer. Said it didn't show her tiredness, only her light. That morning, the king stood before it. Just for a moment, one breath, one stillness. And in that stillness, something happened. What? He never said. He didn't scream, didn't cry. But when he left the room, he didn't call for guards. He didn't destroy the glass. He simply walked to the nearby chair, pulled free a wooden wedge from its base, clumsy, uneven, and wedged the door shut himself. Not locked, just blocked. Crooked, strange, personal. And then he straightened his robe, turned, and walked away without looking back. He never spoke of that morning, never wrote of it. But those who saw him after noticed it. Not immediately, but over time. Something in his eyes had shifted, not darkened, not dulled, just altered, like he was being watched. Not by someone, not even by something alive, but by something that knew how to mimic, how to follow, but not how to feel. Something that smiled only because it had been taught to. Something cold and silver, and not quite empty, but not quite full either. The room stayed untouched for years. The door never fully opened. The brush remained on the vanity. The dust thickened slowly, gently, like snow falling where no footsteps would ever go. But inside the king, the image never left. It stayed, not because of what he had seen, but because of what he hadn't. The queen had once told a story, not loudly, not dramatically, but the way someone might share something ancient while folding fabric or brushing hair, as if it had been whispered into her by the world itself. It was long before the sickness, long before the quiet settled into the palace walls like a second kind of stone. The night had been slow, stretched out like warm honey over a sleeping spoon. The fire had crackled in its familiar rhythm, casting gold onto the hem of her robe, flickering across the tiled floor where the shadows sat politely at her feet. She was by the window, threading a ribbon through her fingers, not with purpose, but with memory. Her voice, low and even, touched with the softness of someone not telling a tale, but recalling one drifted through the room like steam from a teacup. The king, younger then, had barely listened. He had papers spread before him, a goblet half full, the remains of a chessboard abandoned mid-match. But something about her voice, the tempo of it, had carved itself into the walls of that night. There was a kingdom, she said, where mirrors were forbidden. Not by law, not by decree, but by fear. He hadn't looked up then, but her words had tilted the air slightly, like a breeze shifting just enough to be noticed. She spoke. Of a girl a quiet girl. Ordinary in every way except one who looked into a mirror and saw something behind her own reflection. Not a ghost, not a stranger, not even herself, but something other. Something hidden beneath her smile. It didn't walk, didn't breathe, but it followed her, not in space, but in presence, in feeling, in the heavy hush between breaths. And no matter where she turned, it was always just out of sight. One day, the girl shattered the glass, not out of fear, but in defiance. She buried the shards beneath a tree, deep in its roots, where she believed time would forget them. And from that grave, the queen said, a throne grew. A throne made not of gold or stone, but of buried reflections. A throne, she murmured, her voice curling at the edges like parchment in firelight, that no one sat on for long, because reflections don't like to be buried. Her smile then had been small, knowing, it's a kind of smile that meant more than the story itself. At the time, the king had dismissed it as one of her many tales. She had always seen stories in everything, in the way curtains moved when no one touched them, in the way candlelight flickered when no windows were open, in the hush of the balcony wind, like it was carrying a secret it hadn't decided whether to share. He thought of it often, now, not fondly, not wistfully, but like a warning. The tale rose in him like breath trapped beneath ice. Not poetry, not metaphor, but prophecy. He began to see that girl in his dreams, not the one his queen described, but another. A woman older than time, with hollow eyes and a crown too heavy for her head, standing in a hall lined with mirrors that had no end. She did not speak, did not blink. She only looked at him, or through him, and he would wake before knowing. Which, he stopped walking past any reflective surface after that, claimed it was aesthetics. Said the shine unsettled him, too sharp, too vulgar. But the servants knew better. They watched as he had the silver polished off the chalices, the tiles sanded until they no longer shimmered. Even the back garden lake filled with lotus, lilies, and thick reeds until the water stopped showing the sky altogether. He wanted no reflections, none, not even the kind that came softly. The palace began to change, though no one said it aloud. It became quieter, not just in sound, but in purpose. The rooms held themselves differently the way a house feels after someone has gone but left all their belongings behind. The throne room echoed longer. The chapel candles seemed to flicker with less confidence. The windows no longer opened as easily. And the king, wrapped in his silks, his silence, his strange new stillness, no longer felt like a man who was ruling. He felt like a man being remembered, like someone who had already passed through something too deep to speak of and had left. Part of himself on the other side, reflected once, then never quite returned whole. The brush lay on the floor with its bristles fanned across the stone like rays of morning sun caught between sleep and waking. It hadn't fallen with any force. No thud, no crack. Just a delicate sound, a carved wooden handle meeting cold marble with the gentleness of a sigh. And yet the king heard it as if it were a bell rung directly beside his ribs. A low, hollow chime that resonated not in the ears, but in the chest. He didn't pick it up. He only stood still, robes hanging loose around him, the room pressing inward with a breathless hush. The brush looked untouched, but there caught. Between the bristles was a single strand of hair, pale, impossibly fine, almost silver in the weak morning light, though the windows were closed and no sun truly touched the room. His breath slowed, his shoulders softened. He had not heard her voice in years, not even in dreams, which had grown sparse and gray like smoke too thin to hold. And yet, in that room, something of her still lived. Not in the scarf draped across the chair back, not in the perfume bottle on the shelf, but in the air itself, a hush that carried the memory of her voice, not as a sound, but as a shape. the kind of silence left behind when someone thoughtful finishes speaking. And the mirror, it stood exactly where it always had, tall and unmoving. But something about it felt different now, as if it had leaned forward just a little, like a listener who has heard their name whispered across a room. The crack that once laced the bottom corner, faint, almost dismissible, had deepened. Not jagged, just wider. Like a mouth that had parted ever so slightly to begin a sentence it hadn't decided how to finish. The king stepped toward it. Not because he wished to, but because something in him was already moving, like a tether being drawn in. Not curiosity, not dread. Something quieter, gravity, as if he were being returned to it. At first, the mirror showed only the room behind him, its quiet corners, its muted shadows. Then, slowly, his reflection emerged, but it wasn't quite right. The eyes were too dim, the shoulders too straight. Like a sketch of him made by someone who had never met him, but had been told what he looked like. He blinked. The figure blinked too. He tilted his head, just slightly. The reflection hesitated, then followed, but not with the immediacy of a true mirror. It mimicked, it copied, it remembered. And that made it worse. He took a step back. The reflection didn't. It simply stood, watching, not menacingly, not gently. Just patiently, waiting, and in that pause, the king remembered something the queen had said on a rain-heavy evening. It's one of those dusks where every sound feels distant and warm at the same time. She had been brushing her hair by candlelight, her reflection aglow in the vanity mirror, and she'd murmured, almost without meaning to, "Do you think reflections ever get tired of following us?" He had laughed then, not cruelly, just distracted. Told her she was thinking too hard again. But now, standing before this mirror, this version of himself, not quite whole, he wondered if perhaps they did. He left the room without touching the brush, without straightening the chair, without breathing too loudly. He pulled the door gently toward him and slid the wedge back into place, the same uneven piece of wood from years ago. And still, as he turned and walked away, he felt it, not fingers, not breath, but a strand, something invisible, delicate, pulling from the mirror toward the space between his shoulder blades. Not a touch. A knowing. That evening, he gave no explanation. He summoned no counsel. He simply ordered that the mirror be removed, quietly, discreetly. No ceremony. But when the guards arrived, carrying ropes and thick cloths, they found themselves halted not by weight, but by cold. The frame, once warm to the touch, now steamed beneath their gloves. Frost bloomed from the floor in a soft ring around its base. One man burned his palm, trying to lift it. Another, standing in the doorway, refused to cross the threshold at all. They returned to the king pale, trembling, their voices smaller than before. He listened, and said nothing more than let it stay. Slowly, as if the words themselves had been waiting. After that, the palace began to change. Not in any way you could measure with clocks or calendars, just quieter. The birds that nested in the arches above the courtyard left earlier that season, their songs short and strangely tuneless. The bells in the chapel began to ring a shade, off pitch, not wrong, just enough to make the heart tilt. Fires took longer to start. Even the windows misted over from the inside, as if the palace was breathing inward, holding something it couldn't exhale. The few remaining mirrors, those hidden or forgotten, began to behave oddly. They rippled just slightly when no one moved. Like the surface of water touched by a thought, in one of them, tucked behind the old staircase near the library. A young maid claimed to see the queen, not her reflection. Her shape, her smile. Standing just behind the king's image, gentle, waiting. When the maid looked again, both were gone. The king stopped walking the halls after that, stayed in his chambers. Curtains always drawn. fires burning low. He spoke less. Only when asked, slept, though never deeply. But he wrote pages upon pages, not titled, not signed, no dates. Just thoughts poured from his hand as though they had been waiting for years to be allowed to exist. When finished, he folded each and placed them into a small wooden box beside the bed. The box grew heavier. No one read them. No one dared. But they knew the way people know things without being told that those pages weren't confessions. They were memories, apologies, echoes. And beneath it all, beneath the quiet, beneath the frost, beneath the man who no longer wept but had clearly forgotten how to smile, there lived one quiet truth. The mirror had not lied, had not cursed, had not even warned. It had only shown him something he had spent years avoiding. Not a ghost, not a prophecy, not even her, but the single, cold, still moment where he had stopped being the man she loved and become a reflection of himself that even he could no longer follow. The king began waking at odd hours. Not the kind of hours marked by clocks, but those soft, disoriented pockets of time that exist between one breath and the next, when even the stars seem unsure if they should keep shining. It was always before dawn or long after the night had exhaled its final hush, when darkness felt less like absence and more like a waiting room for forgotten thoughts. He no longer dreamed. Dreams required rest, and his sleep had grown shallow, more like floating, then sinking. He would sit up in bed, spine slightly bent, hands resting gently in his lap as though folded in prayer, while the candle at his bedside stood melted to a smooth pool of wax that glowed faintly, like memory. He never called for anyone. Not a steward, not a servant, not even the boy who once brought him warm broth. He simply listened to the quiet that wasn't truly quiet, to the palace breathing around him. Sometimes it was a creak beyond the door, soft and slow, the kind of sound that suggested someone had started walking toward him and then stopped just outside reach. Other times it was more subtle, the delicate drag of a brush through hair, a whisper too unfinished to become a word, the faint sigh of fabric turning on sheets at the edge of the bed, even though he was alone. These things didn't scare him anymore, not because they made sense, but because they didn't. They no longer felt foreign. They felt remembered, as though the past had learned how to move without footsteps, how to speak without breath, how to return without asking permission. He did not look over his shoulder. He simply waited until the air felt still again. The wooden box beside his bed grew heavier with each passing week. He filled it slowly, page by page, sheets of parchment folded like offerings, like quiet prayers dropped into a well that had no bottom. Each page was written in the same hand, careful and unhurried. The ink varied, but the message remained, nearly identical. Over and over again, I didn't look away. I just didn't know what I was seeing. Not addressed to anyone, sealed or signed. He never crossed out a word. He simply folded each one and added it to the others, not for her, not for himself, but for the reflection that once mimicked him, and then, one day, stopped. That had been the moment everything shifted. Not when the mirror cracked, not when the queen left, but when the image failed to follow, when he no longer saw a copy, only a question. Outside his chambers, the kingdom moved forward. Seasons passed the way they always had. Snow came and left. Harvests bloomed and faded. Children were born, and their names were sung through courtyards and carved into new stones. In taverns, laughter rose again. In gardens, lovers read poetry out loud beneath thinning trees. But the palace, the one that held the king at its heart, began to fall into a rhythm of pause. The bells tolled less. When they did, their chimes seemed slower, almost unsure. The once bold banners that had danced in the wind now hung limp, their edges frayed, their colors dulled. Even the pigeons, long accustomed to nesting in the tower beams, began to coo less, and when they did, their calls were shorter, quieter, as if speaking in reverence to something they could sense but not see. The palace wasn't decaying. It was waiting. And then, one day, a mirror appeared. Not in the western wing. That door remained sealed, its air thick with frost, its memory too loud. No. This mirror appeared quietly in a small vestibule behind the chapel, a forgotten space where old hymnals gathered dust and where servants sometimes went to cry when no one was looking. It was oval, silver-edged, untouched by time. No one had placed it there. It had simply arrived. A footman saw it first, then a cook, then 2 pages who insisted it had not been there the day before. No dust clung to its frame, no smudges blurred its face, and worst of all, it didn't reflect properly. Some who looked into it saw themselves as children. Others saw themselves aged and trembling, faces they hadn't worn yet. One girl said she watched herself cry, even though she was laughing. Another man claimed he saw his twin, long dead, standing behind him, mouth unmoving, eyes wide. The king was told. He listened, and then, with the quiet of someone who already knew, he said only, "Let it be. Mirrors go where they are needed." From that moment on, they began to appear, not in floods, not in storms, but steadily, in odd places, on the underside of a serving tray, in a basin of still water that refused to ripple, behind a canvas that had hung for years without being touched. No 2 mirrors behaved alike. One reflected nothing at all, only void. Another showed only what stood behind you. One caught the room, but not the people within it. One refused to reflect unless you were crying. Another held an eternal dusk, no matter the hour, the kind of dusk where birds stop singing and lamps have not yet been lit. Servants whispered among themselves. Some began to avoid drinking water, afraid of their own reflections. Others wrapped cloth around their eyes before walking down certain halls. A maid, unable to bear the pressure, shattered a mirror in the sewing room with a broom handle. The shards did not fall. They floated, suspended like snowflakes in midair, before vanishing into smoke. The king, however, did not flinch. He did not shudder himself. He did not speak against them. In fact, one morning he did the opposite. He requested a new mirror, not from memory, not from the old collection, but a new one, small, round, plain, framed in ash wood, with no carvings, no silver, no memory. And he ordered it hung just outside his door. When it was in place, he stood before it in stillness for nearly an hour. No one dared interrupt. The guards said he didn't blink, didn't shift, just breathed, as if waiting for the mirror to catch up. And when he was done, he turned and re-entered his chamber, leaving the door slightly open the first time in years. That door, like the rest of him, had begun to change. Not because the mirrors had, but because he had. He no longer feared what he might see, because he no longer looked to be seen. In the days that followed, the king began to walk again, slowly, carefully, not far, never beyond the walls of the palace grounds, but often, as if his feet had remembered something his mind had forgotten. From his chamber to the chapel. From the chapel to the outer garden steps, where the light in the afternoon took on that particular golden hush, the kind that made the air feel thick with memory, and the stones beneath his sandals feel warm with presence. It was during these small pilgrimages that his robes began to change. No more brocades, no metal threads. He wore soft cloth now, plain, unadorned, not out of humility, but because silk and gold seemed too sharp for the kind of silence he was learning to carry. He spoke to people again, not often, not long, but with a softness that made his voice feel like it had been missing from the world and was only just returning. A gardener received a nod, gentle and warm. The boy who lit the lanterns was greeted with a low murmur and a look that suggested the king remembered his name, even if he did not speak it. There was no crown on his head, only white in his beard, and a kind of kindness in his eyes that had not been seen in many years. And still, the mirrors continued to appear, quietly, without announcement, without placement. A shard gleaming from the curve of a doorknob, a silver ripple inside a drinking bowl. A puddle that refused to dry even in sunlight, holding reflections not of the sky, but of windows that no longer existed. Each one was just slightly wrong, not broken, not malicious, just off, tilted as though remembering a different truth than the room around it. And the king never looked away. He stopped before each one, not hurried, not cautious, but with stillness, as though giving the mirror permission to see him, just as he was, without demanding anything in return. It wasn't curiosity that kept him still. It was something closer to recognition, a willingness to be held without being explained. One afternoon, while wandering farther than usual, his steps carried him past the old reading room, a space he had not entered since the Queen's voice had last been heard in those halls. The door was slightly ajar. A breeze, faint as a breath, drifted through the stained glass and lifted a ribbon from beneath the door pale, almost translucent, fluttering like something trying to remember how to move. He stepped inside. The room smelled of lavender and old paper, the scent of forgotten letters and gentle things said quietly. Dust motes drifted like tiny memories, swirling in the light without direction. Near the window, on a table long, untouched, sat a wooden box. Simple, no lock, no carvings. Just waiting, like something that knew its moment had finally come. He opened it with both hands, slowly. Inside, a letter. The paper was delicate, crisp with age, the ink faded, but unmistakably hers. The Queen's hand, soft, sweeping, shaped like her laughter used to be when she laughed without needing permission. "If you are reading this," it began, "then perhaps the mirror has changed you." He did not sit. He stood in the quiet, the letter trembling slightly in his hands as though the words themselves were alive. "You always feared what you couldn't explain." But the mirror was never meant to explain, only to witness. I kept it not to see myself, but to see what time does to truth. The words moved through him like water warming cold stone. "You saw something once, something that scared you. I know. I felt it, but you never asked what I saw, what I had been carrying, what I hoped you might one day see reflected too." His throat tightened. The room held its breath. Mirrors don't hold answers. They only show what we bring to them. If you looked and saw loss, perhaps that loss was already living in you, not from me, but from the parts of yourself you'd buried in duty, in silence, in the fear that love makes us fragile. He folded the letter with care, like a memory that had waited too long to be touched, pressed it to his chest, closed his eyes. He did not weep. He did not shake. But he breathed the kind of breath that only comes when something deep inside, long held and unspoken, finally exhales. He remained in that room until the sun reached the window's edge, said nothing, summoned no one, just sat by the light. As it dimmed, the letter resting beside him, and as dusk fell across the shelves and pages, the mirror above the fireplace caught the last of the sunlight, and in it, only for a moment, he saw her, not behind him, not beside him, but in him, in the softness that returned to his face, in the corners of his eyes where light once lived and now flickered again. When the sun finally left the glass, the image faded, but something of it stayed in the room, like warmth in a cushion, long after the one you love has stood. From that day forward, the palace began to shift, not back to what it had been, but forward into something gentler. The walls seemed to release the breath they had been holding for years. Servants no longer tiptoed. Laughter returned softly at first, like a murmur, then like a song half-remembered. Birds came back. Music too, not the loud trumpets of ceremony, but gentle melodies hummed under one's breath, the kind played in corners no one looked at, where only the past listened. The mirrors stopped appearing. Some disappeared. Some stayed. But they no longer moved. They no longer needed to. They had shown what needed to be seen, and now they rested. And the king? He grew quieter, yes, but not hidden. He walked the gardens in the morning, wrote words no one else read, sat with his tea until it went cold. Sometimes, in the late hours, he would speak to the mirror in his chamber, not to examine himself, not to relive the past, but simply to be less alone. Not to remember, but to continue. Because some reflections are not memories of what we've lost. They are reminders of what we still carry. Quietly, softly, faithfully, even when we forget how to look. The palace changed in ways no decree could measure, no herald could announce. No trumpets were sounded. No banners unfurled from the towers. And yet, if you stood quietly enough, you could feel it in the way the walls exhaled, not loudly, but with the relief of something long held being gently released. The warmth that returned was not the heat of fire or the roar of celebration. It was the warmth of life resuming at its own rhythm. There was laughter again, though it arrived cautiously at first, like a bird testing a new branch. It fluttered through corridors that had once fallen silent, threading itself into the kitchen air, into the garden paths, into rooms where no one had spoken above a whisper in years. The scent of bread, soft, sweet, dusted with flour, drifted through hallways like a lullaby for the waking house. Children, once kept away out of respect or fear, or both, were allowed back into the garden. They moved gently, as if sensing the softness of the ground, their footsteps creating tiny patterns in the morning dew that faded as the sun rose. And when the king saw them wide-eyed, curious, laughing at nothing and everything, he would pause in the shadow of a tree, and for a moment he looked not like a ruler, but like a man remembering how to feel joy without questioning it. He no longer sat upon the high throne. That grand hall, with its vaulted arches and ceremonial echoes, remained untouched. Dust gathered slowly in its corners. The sun entered. Less boldly, it had become a room for memory, not use. Instead, the king met with those who sought him beneath the old birch tree in the eastern courtyard, a place where petals fell in silence, like memories that no longer needed to be kept, hidden. The tree was older than most of the walls. Its bark peeled in soft curls, its roots curled like folded hands. He sat in linen, a simple cloak wrapped around his shoulders when it was cold. In his lap, a book, not of laws, not of names, but of blank pages, which he filled slowly with things that couldn't be measured by maps or treaties. He wrote of smells, of the way wood sounds when it is split for winter, of how the wind shifts slightly when it carries grief instead of rain. He never called it a journal, never titled it formally. But on the first page, with only his finger, he had once traced the words "Book of Softness." No ink, no need, just a quiet intention pressed into the paper. The mirror in his chamber remained. It was the only one left that he allowed to stay uncovered. He did not tend to it, did not polish its face or dust its edges. A chip had appeared in its side, thin as a crescent moon, but he did not call for repairs. Each morning he would light a single candle, open the eastern window, and stand before it for a moment, never longer than it took to remember that he was still here, not checking his face, not checking the time, just acknowledging that he was, that he still carried breath and quiet. and the shape of a man who had once feared what the glass might reveal, and now stood before it without asking for anything in return. One morning, a young servant noticed something strange. The mirror, which had always shown only the king and his chamber, now held something more. Not an image, not a figure, but a glow. Soft, steady. The color of morning just before it becomes gold. It shimmered behind him for a breath, then disappeared. The next day, it returned, and the day after. Always faint. Always brief. The king never spoke of it. But soon, a second cushion appeared by the fireplace. Quietly, without explanation. And sometimes, late into the night. The guards stationed outside his chamber would hear his voice, not loud, not distressed, but steady, murmuring, speaking to someone, or perhaps to no one. The way people do when they are telling stories. To the past, he spoke of Jasmine after rain, of the way her hand would rest beneath her chin when she listened carefully, of how she disliked mint but loved the sound of wind chimes in the cold. These were not performances, not declarations. They were tiny gifts, not to be heard, just to be spoken, laid gently, again and again, at the altar of memory. One evening, during the season's first snow, when the world felt covered in hush and the trees held their branches like breath, a chambermaid brought him tea. She found the door unlatched. The fire was fading. The candle near the mirror still flickered. The king sat asleep in the chair, a soft smile resting gently across his mouth like an old blanket. She paused, and in the mirror, just for a breath. No more she saw him not as he was, but as he had once been. Younger, unlined, shoulders straight, but not burdened. And beside him sat the queen, not as a ghost, not as memory, but as presence. No crown, no costume. Just her, as if she had never left. As if time had bent backward for a moment just to let them be side by side again. The flame trembled, the image faded, but the warmth stayed. The chambermaid placed the tea on the table, gently pulled the blanket higher over his chest, and left without speaking a word. The king did not stir. That night, as the snow thickened and the moon dipped low, something inside the mirror shifted. Not its shape, not its frame, but its purpose. It no longer offered a reflection. It no longer asked who stood before it. It no longer mimicked the moment. It simply remembered. And in that remembering, it became something else entirely. The days grew quieter, not from emptiness, but from a kind of fullness that only comes after long waiting, like the hush that follows a lullaby, or the space between two waves where the ocean holds its breath. The palace no longer measured time in bells or feasts. It moved instead in the small, soft markers of a life lived slowly, the clink of a teacup on polished wood, the flutter of curtains as dusk entered the room, the way candlelight stretched across the floorboards like fingers reaching for stories. The king had stopped counting seasons. He no longer asked what month it was or how many years had passed since the world changed. His sense of time became gentler, woven into small rituals. The warmth of a robe fresh from the sun, the sound of sparrows nesting near his window, the comfort of hearing his name spoken not with formality, but with memory. He did not fear mirrors now, not because he had conquered them, but because he had made peace with what they offered. Not curses, not omens, but pauses. Places where a moment could sit down beside itself and be seen, not judged, just witnessed. Mirrors, he had learned, didn't ask for answers. They waited for presence. And he had finally learned how to give it. Visitors came, not as audiences, but as old friends returning to the slow, familiar cadence of someone they once knew. They were not princes or statesmen, but the sons of gardeners, the daughters of bakers, people who remembered his voice before it grew quiet, People who had laughed with him when his robe still shone with gold. When the queen still sang in the corridors, they brought no formal gifts, only stories. Simple ones, of apples so red they looked painted. Of dreams they barely remembered, but felt were important. Of lullabies sung while folding linens passed down through voices older than parchment. And the king listened. Not with the intent to speak, but with the full open quiet of someone who had let go of needing to respond. He listened as though their words filled a room in his chest that had once been locked. One day, beneath the birch tree where the petals now fell more slowly, a boy sat beside his grandfather and, after much hesitation, asked a question no one had dared ask in years. "Why don't you have any mirrors in your halls?" The question did not stir the guards. It did not shift the air, but something softened in the king's face. He looked at the child with eyes that had once carried storms and now only held sunrises. Because for a while, he said gently, "I forgot that reflections don't bite, they only echo." And then he smiled, not the smile of duty, not the smile practiced for portraits, not the real one, the kind that feels like an old coat rediscovered in winter. The kind that had waited patiently behind his silence all this time. That night, he left his window open. Snow drifted in like stardust, settling on the sill, on the edge of his desk, on the open page where a sentence had been paused mid-thought, not because he didn't know what to write, but because he had learned the beauty of leaving some things unfinished. The fire had gone out hours before. The room was dim, touched only by the flickering glow of a single candle near the mirror. And in the glass, the king's reflection remained, not just as image, but as presence. The flame danced longer than it should have, as if reluctant to leave. And even after he closed his eyes, even after his breath slowed into the softness of sleep, the mirror still held him. Not hauntingly, not with mystery, just still. As if it had finally learned not just how to reflect him, but how to keep him, not as a shadow, not as a record, but as something remembered gently, like a handprint in velvet, a warmth in a chair long after someone has risen, a memory that didn't need to be explained, only held. The final weeks of the king's life passed not with fanfare, not with farewells or proclamations, but with the same soft rhythm that had come to define his presence. Like the final verses of a lullaby that no one wanted to end, he woke early, always before the bells, when the world still felt half-dreamed. He drank warm broth from a plain cup, cradled in hands that no longer signed decrees, only pages of personal thought. He sat by the eastern window, where the ivy climbed gently down the stone like soft handwriting forgotten mid-sentence. Outside, the seasons changed without urgency. Inside, the king simply watched. His words grew fewer, yet fuller. Each one offered seemed plucked not for its meaning, but for how it might rest in the air after he was gone. How it might echo gently in a hallway, or settle quietly in someone's chest like a feather. He requested no painting, no statue in the garden, no inscription beneath stained glass. Instead, he made one simple request, that no mirror be removed from the palace after his passing, and that none be added. "Let the reflections stay," he whispered to the steward one morning, his voice as faint as silk against the folds of his blanket, "where they have learned to rest." And the staff, those who had served him in stillness, in silence, in softness, obeyed without hesitation. They did not polish the glass. They did not change the angles. They did not remove the dust. The mirrors remained as they were, smudged, patient, quiet, some half-lit by morning sun, others dimmed by time, but all strangely kind. Visitors began to pause before them, not in fear, not in superstition, but in reverence. Some whispered secrets they could not say aloud. Others simply stood in front of the glass and breathed, waiting for the reflection to feel less like a stranger and more like an old companion. And there were murmurs, soft ones, that in the mirror near the old library staircase, if you stood long enough, you wouldn't just see yourself. You'd see the version of you that someone else had loved. Not the bravest, not the wisest, but the softest. The version that was seen fully, gently, without needing to explain. A kind of hush settled across the palace. Not a mourning, not a heaviness, but a grace. A deep, quiet understanding that something sacred had been lived, not loudly, but fully. A life that had once fought its own reflection had finally learned how to sit beside it, shoulder to shoulder, in peace. And then, on a night pale with moonlight, when the wind curled around the towers like a lullaby looking for its final note, the king's last breath came. Not with pain, not with fear, but with such gentleness that it folded itself into the room. Without waking a soul, no one heard it. Not because it was missed, but because it had arrived like everything else he had come to love, quietly. In the morning, a servant entered his chamber with careful steps and trembling hands, unsure what she would find. But the room was not cold. It was not empty. The blanket still held the shape of his rest. The tea on the table was still faintly warm. The page on the desk remained unfinished, a sentence trailing off mid-thought, as if he'd simply paused, for breath and might return to finish it any moment. And the mirror above the writing desk, still held his image. Eyes closed, shoulders relaxed, not trapped, not fading. Just present, like the reflection had chosen to remain, even after the man himself had gone. Not because it had to, but because it wanted to. And for days afterward, no one dared touch it. No one wiped the glass. No one relit the candle. Not out of fear, but out of something deeper. Something that had no name. Because for the first time in living memory, the mirror was no longer simply a mirror. It had become something else. Witness. A keeper. A quiet friend to a man who had once feared what he might see in its depths, and who, in the end, had shown a kingdom how to look gently, bravely, and tenderly at itself again. So now, somewhere in a palace where no one speaks too loudly, where ivy climbs like forgotten handwriting across the window panes and the halls smell faintly of old paper and rose tea, there sits a room, not locked, not forbidden, just quiet. The mirror inside does not shimmer, it does not glow. But if you stand before it calmly, with no hurry and no question in your heart, it will show you something small. The way light curves across your shoulder, the weight you didn't know you were carrying. The part of you that still remembers how to love what once frightened you. The king is gone now, yes, but he is not lost, not really. He lives in the soft rituals, the folded letters tucked in drawers never opened, the way wind brushes past. The chapel's candle each dusk, the gentle hush of someone turning a page in the reading room without rushing. They say if you walk the halls alone, you might hear a faint brushing sound, like a comb pulled through long hair in the next room. Or a voice, not whispering, not calling, just remembering. The kingdom never raised a statue for him. There is no grand tomb, no painted banner, no gold-threaded tapestry bearing his name. Just the mirrors, still hanging, still reflecting, and in each of them, something remains. Not his face, not his crown, but his quiet, his warmth, his final lesson, that even fear, when held gently enough, can turn into peace. And in that peace, we all might find a reflection worth keeping.